How does Miranda's story end? Episode 10 of Station 11 begins in the past, with Miranda talking to Clark about their changing fates. For Miranda, she's stuck in Malaysia. Clark is at the airport. Miranda struggles to stifle her coughs, while on the phone, very clearly sick. She urges Clark to look after Elizabeth and Tyler, her final wish before this flu ravages them all. Miranda checks the plane from her laptop and does her best to liaise with the pilot to make sure the plane that touches down from Chicago doesn't let anyone out. Learning the captain's name is Hugo, and with a number to hand, Miranda gets through to him and converses with the pilot, urging him not to open the plane. She admits they don't deserve to die like caged animals, but in doing this, they'll save those inside the airport. As she hangs up the phone, the last shot we see of her is lying motionless on the ground, showing that she's died. Who is directing the play? Kirsten and the rest of the symphony learn that their quarantine is over. While most are happy, Kirsten isn't ready to let this grudge go yet. She sits down with Elizabeth and hashes out her problems. Kirsten mentions how, for 20 years, no other town or city has locked them up despite fighting for survival. She's not happy with the way their people have treated them. Kirsten agrees to do one show, and then they'll be leaving. For good. Not only that, Kirsten is getting back to directing as well, pushing Elizabeth out. The Hamlet casting. That night, Alex quizzes Kirsten over exactly who is going to be playing Hamlet. As fate would have it, it's going to be the prophet, Tyler. Alex challenges Kirsten's idea and even suggests they stay at the airport for a year instead of leaving. Kirsten refuses to negotiate though. Clark too is unhappy with Hamlet's casting, but Kirsten admits this is the only way she can get him to open up and talk to her. She also admits to trying to kill the prophet, but being unable to do so. Handing over the Station 11 comic, she reveals exactly who she is and what connection she has to the comic. When Clark realizes she was the little girl from the King Lear production, he's understandably shocked. This also helps him to let go of his resentment, agreeing to let Tyler play his role. He also decides to play Claudius. Why? Well, that's what Arthur would have wanted. What happens during the Hamlet production? The main act begins and the Hamlet production takes place. There's a pretty unnerving moment involving Tyler and a knife, but he keeps his cool and doesn't kill Clark, which is obviously a bonus. There are, however, hints that he has a larger plan at work here, given all the kids walking toward the airport. As Kirsten heads outside, she notices one of the prophet's kids showing up with beacons ready to serve as beacons. Kirsten gains the girl's trust and shows off the Station 11 comic, pointing out that this is where the origin of the prophecy comes from. However, she soon scarpers away, leaving Kirsten on her own. What happens to Sarah? In the middle of all this drama, a few minutes are dedicated to closing out Sarah's story. After her heart attack several episodes ago, she never recovers from her injuries. Kirsten hears chatter on Clark's radio, revealing that the conductor is dead. This is, of course, referring to Sarah. She's later informed directly that Sarah hasn't made it, leaving the symphony in need of a new conductor for the future. Does Tyler reconnect with his mum? Inside, Elizabeth catches up with her son. She apologizes for everything and admits she would have left with Tyler had he asked. Since leaving, Tyler has been much happier, and Elizabeth does her best to support him, smiling warmly. Breaking down his walls, this kindness helps to allow Tyler to reconnect with his mum, hugging her. As he does, all the bitterness and animosity leaves. How does Station 11 end? As music picks up that night, following the lights being turned back on, Kirsten reconnects with Jeevan again, who finds his way back to her. It's a really touching reunion, and one that eventually leads to the symphony heading back out on the road. Only this time, Jeevan is with them and he talks about the past. Kirsten throws her arms around him and thanks Jeevan for walking her home all those years ago. With a fork in the road, Kirsten and Jeevan say their goodbyes as she promises to wheel around the next year when the symphony returns. As he walks away, the series comes to a close. Theory of last episode. So the big conflict with Tyler comes to a close with an hour that basically works to patch up all the character conflicts and wrap up this story with a neat little bow. Don't get me wrong, Station 11 has been a visually stunning and poetically beautiful series, but it's also incredibly unrealistic too. You need to suspend an awful lot of disbelief to get into this, and while that may be fine or some, hearing Kirsten telling Elizabeth that for the years they've been performing they've never experienced any hostility or been locked up just seems ludicrous. We know there are scavengers in this world and we know how selfish people can be. Hell, look at this pandemic and how quickly people began to hoard resources and sell them off for higher prices. There will always be opportunists. However, Station 11 has been less about actually surviving and more about how important the arts are. In that respect, this has been a really enjoyable watch. The highlight of the episode, though, is the reunion between Kirsten and Jeevan. This really helps wheel the entire show around to the opening few chapters, not to mention Miranda's important role in all this. The sense of finality is definitely felt, and her selfless act essentially saves everyone inside the museum. Station 11 has been an enjoyable watch over the weeks, with a final episode that rounds everything out with a neat little bow. While it seems unlikely that there will be a second season, there's certainly room for this one to grow. For now, though, the symphony keeps on marching on, singing and performing in this incredibly peaceful world. What would happen if a deadly virus ravaged the planet and left only a fraction of the population alive? Would you hoard resources? Form a faction? Or would you travel from town to town performing plays and singing songs to spread joy? If you chose the third option, Station 11 may just be the perfect post-apocalyptic rom for you. Jokes aside, Station 11 is a beautifully poetic and undeniably artistic series, albeit one that requires you to go into this without thinking about the wider world and a realistic survival situation. Instead, Station 11 tackles some pretty big themes and ultimately relies on its characters and their story to do the heavy lifting. For those after a realistic slice of post-apocalyptic fiction, you won't find that here. There's absolutely nothing realistic about the premise or wider world mechanics, which does threaten to tumble the entire premise at almost every moment. It's not helped either by the story beginning with a rather erratic and haphazard opening episode. Erratic flashbacks flit back and forth between the future, where we spend most of our time, and the present, which ultimately becomes the past in later episode flashbacks. A deadly flu has started to spread across the world, and it's fatal. It wipes out most of the population, leaving fragments of humanity to try and survive in this new world. At the center of this is the most important part of this apocalypse: the arts. For Kirsten, she's had a rough upbringing. Left alone at the theater as a 10-year-old girl, she's walked home by anxious Jeevan, but the pair soon form a band and brave this new world together. This storyline of the pair together and their tumultuous time in the wild is then sprinkled across 10 episodes, serving as a long-running flashback to show exactly what's happened to these two over time. The post-apocalypse story with the traveling symphony, a motley band of theater lovers who perform shows at different towns, is where we spend the majority of our time. Instead of farming or scavenging resources, the future is dependent on the arts continuing, with Kirsten a part of this enthusiastic and ever so slightly naive group. As they move between cities and towns, a looming threat known as the prophet lurks in the shadows, but ultimately this falls flat. There's not an awful lot of conflict here, at least externally, as most of the trauma comes from the past, where we only see this drama play out in flashbacks. The way the past and present weave together is, admittedly, one of the best parts of the show. When Station 11 focuses on its theater group shenanigans and their mission to spread joy to people presumably starving and desperate for resources, which they don't ever steal from this troupe, I may add, it's nowhere near as strong as these past flashbacks. The flashbacks are incredibly well done though, and credit where credit's due. Station 11 has some excellent standalone moments. A few episodes that focus exclusively on Jeevan and Kirsten are outstanding. Their tale is shocking, heartbreaking, and utterly enthralling. When it comes to character development and thematic relevance, Station 11 does a great job. The characters are really well written, and aside from a little bit of contrivance in the final episode to tie everything together, is wholly satisfying. If you can go into this one knowing the show will not even try to make sense of its post-apocalyptic world, which admittedly falls apart when you even start to think of the mechanics of this one, you'll be gripped by what's here. Station 11 is ultimately a beautiful, fantastical and utterly unrealistic look at a reimagined world where art reigns supreme. As a thematic think piece and artistic showpiece, you won't find anything better than what's presented here. With well-written characters and a few outstanding flashback episodes, this is certainly worth checking out. If, however, you're looking for a more bleak and realistic slice of post-apocalyptic action, you certainly won't find